always wanted that. Of course, I put the work in and I got that. But that doesn't stop me. I always dreamt of that, and I wondered. I always wanted that. I want to be bigger than Dwayne Johnson, bigger than him. So that means I need more work. So this notion of when people say, "Oh, you're Hollywood now," it's going through his head. That thing is ridiculous to me. And if he's thinking that, that's the biggest misconception. It'll be a short night for him come Saturday night.
Ben Askren hit the headlines by calling Kamaru Usman Marty from Nebraska. And while sure, the whole thing came across as a joke at Usman's expense, there's actually more to this than you might think. Back when Usman was an unassuming kid who was becoming acquainted with wrestling mats, an early roll sheet call left his coach baffled by his full name, Kamaru. Instead of trying to learn how to say it out of politeness, his coach decided to shorten it to Marty. Ben Askren caught wind of this, and the rest, as they say, was history.
He's reading the roll sheet, calling names, and he goes, Kamaru, who's this kid? Who the fuck is this kid? And I'm like, that's me, coach. He's like, that's your name? I'm like, yeah. He's like, I'm not saying that because my whole full name is Kamaru. And he's like, I'm not going to say that. I'm going to call you Marty. And I'm just like, yeah, sure, coach.
Born in Auchi, Nigeria, Kamaru Usman's father was a major in the national military, while his mother was a schoolteacher. After spending the first 8 years of his life in his home country, Kamaru moved to the US when he was 8, eventually finding his way to the wrestling mats, setting in course a chain of events that would eventually lead him to UFC gold. To this day, he is quite proud of his Nigerian heritage, openly drawing attention to it whenever possible, and even using it for his fighter nickname. But we'll get to that in a moment. Kamaru Usman's nickname is one that strikes fear into the hearts of those who hear it. Or at least it should. It's a pretty damn good nickname. But what's interesting about the longtime welterweight champion's moniker is that it isn't actually his. Back when he was starting his fighting career, Kamaru actually reached out to the former NFL running back Christian Okoye about using the nickname the Nigerian Nightmare, a title that Okoye used during his 5-year stint in the NFL in the late 80s and early 90s. Thankfully, the football player gave Usman his blessing, leading to the creation of one of the sport's most memorable fighter aliases. One look at Kamaru Usman is enough to know that he is one incredibly gifted athlete. As a man of immense physical strength, it's wild just how well his cardio holds up in a 5-round fight. In fact, the way he's able to weaponize his pace is probably his biggest strength in 25-minute battles. But during an eye-opening interview with Joe Rogan on his podcast, Rogan and his guest Will Harris spoke openly about the incredibly debilitating knee problems that Usman has been forced to deal with. Kamaru himself has admitted that he prefers to walk on grass instead of concrete, and if he has to walk a long flight of stairs, he tends to go down them backwards to reduce the pressure. It really does put his greatness into clearer perspective, right? Kamaru's father was imprisoned for a large portion of his son's reign as a champion due to a messy situation involving money laundering and healthcare fraud. Receiving a sentence of 15 years in jail after being found guilty of 14 federal charges, Kamaru himself made it clear that his dad was not at fault, and that the people who worked for his father's company were at fault, not him.
I really haven't ever shared with anybody, very, very few people know, is that my father has been incarcerated since 2009.
The elder Usman owned an ambulance company and seemingly was left with the brunt of the punishment when it should have been his paramedics who were liable. Thankfully, once he had fulfilled his sentence, the two were reunited, and Kamaru's father was finally able to watch his son compete. Some fighters are so naturally talented in their base sport that they jump into MMA before they've fully grasped all of the core skills needed to succeed. And for Kamaru Usman, this is exactly what happened. After winning his debut by second round TKO, Kamaru was set up for a fight against a much more experienced grappler, and, as you might expect, it did not go well. He suffered a pretty rapid rear naked choke defeat in the first round, making it clear to him that he needed to work on his skills. His next loss would not come for another 9 years until his famous defeat to Leon Edwards. You might not be aware that Kamaru Usman has a younger brother, and though the idea of Kamaru's little brother might spring to mind images of a smaller version of the former 170-pound champion, no, Usman's younger brother is in fact a heavyweight. The UFC rostered Muhammad Usman. After winning the Ultimate Fighter with a second-round knockout, this 32-year-old prospect will no doubt have his sights on reaching the heights of his brother's legacy. Can he do it? Well, it's too early to say, but it's clear that fighting runs in the Usman family. Usman getting dethroned by Leon Edwards in the fashion he did was one of the craziest comebacks in UFC history. But you might be surprised to know about this very unique statistic. Prior to 2022, only 2 UFC title challengers had ever dethroned an undisputed champ in the 5th round. TJ Dillashaw against Renan Barao and Miesha Tate against Holly Holm. In 2022, it happened 3 times, with Israel Adesanya, Glover Teixeira, and Kamaru Usman all losing by 5th round stoppage to their challenger. What does this mean? Probably nothing, but it's an interesting stat nonetheless. It seems like a long time ago now, but back when Kamaru Usman was making his initial assault on the welterweight title, he wasn't exactly known as the most entertaining fighter. In fact, he almost started off full-on feud in an earlier bout, after putting on a wrestling-heavy display against Emil Weber-Meek. After taking to the mic following his pretty low-key performance, Usman claimed that he was only showing about 30% of his game.
Listen, I fought this fight sitting at about 30%. Everybody knows what I'm capable of. That was 30% right there, and I still dominated a tough so-called Viking. Dominated him, and that was at 30%.
Now, of course, there are many different ways to interpret what he meant by that. But overall, to say that Dana White was angry would be putting it lightly.
Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to click the bell to be notified of future videos.